everyone, welcome to Worlds Apart. After years of being unable to strike a peace deal with the Palestinians, Israel now wants to have a say in the resolution of another conflict, this time in Syria. Its objective is clear, to minimize the regional influence of Iran, but isn't it a little bit too late in the game? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Tzipi Livni, a prominent Israeli politician and former foreign minister of Israel. Ms. Livni, it's great to see you. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Now, you're currently in the opposition to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but as far as I understand, when it comes to the issue of Iran, most Israeli politicians agree that it represents a major deadly threat to Israel that has to be curtailed through all possible means. Am I right in formulating your position?
Yes, and not only for Israeli politicians. We believe that Iran is a problem to Israel, but not only to Israel, but to the entire region. And therefore, it needs to be dealt with the entire international community as such.
I assume Prime Minister Netanyahu, who recently visited Russia, communicated something along those same lines to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Do you by any chance know how the Russians have responded to those concerns raised by the Israeli Prime Minister?
I hope that also Russia would understand that Israel's concern are part of the concerns of other states in the region and not only. Listen, Iran is part of the problem. Iran would not accept the right of Israel to exist. Iran supports Hezbollah, which is a terrorist organization in Lebanon. Iran supports terror in the region and finances terror in the region. And therefore, we all understand that there's a need to give an answer, of course, and to confront Daesh, ISIS, with all they are doing in the region, but we also need to confront, to minimize, and to reduce the power of Iran. And we are looking at the day after. I mean, we are all familiar of the situation in Syria right now. And the real question is what the day after would look like. If we would see Iran and then Iran influence in Iraq and Iran influence in Syria and Iran influence in Lebanon with Hezbollah, this would be a huge problem. And we believe, as I said before, that this is something that needs to be dealt by the entire international community. Do we want Iran as a state that supports terror as a superpower in the region? In the past, when we initiated Resolution 1701 against Hezbollah, Russia was part of it in an understanding that this is a terrorist organization. So even though now Iran is being a part of those that are fighting others in Syria and in the region, let's speak now about the day after. Let's try to minimize their influence in the future, because it's going to be problematic not only for Israel, I can assure you.
There is also a realization that without Iran, you cannot stabilize Syria or perhaps the region more generally.
Let's look at the region from in a kind of satellite perspective. And Iran, in the past, the world dealt with Iran on their nuclear program, and they reached an agreement. Now, firstly, we need to see that this agreement is being implemented as it should. Secondly, as long as Iran supports terror, the entire international community should say to Iran, this is not acceptable. You should stop financing terror. From our perspective, it's Hezbollah, it's Hamas. For others, it's what they do in other places. But this is something that I believe Israel should sit together with Russia, of course with the United States, with other states, and to say, okay, it's not just, a small Israeli problem. Let's look at the region.
Wouldn't it be fair to say that in Syria, Israel found itself on the losing side, and now you are trying to get your way through diplomatic means, which is fair, but that doesn't mean that you should get all that you are asking for.
Israel, since day one, decided not to involve in the situation in Syria. We are just trying to help those wounded people that are trying to come here.
Well, many of them were wounded fighters and wounded jihadists.
We are helping those that need help and they're coming to Israeli border and give them and help them in Israeli hospital. This is humanitarian stuff. But Israel is not involved in the situation in Syria, and rightly so. But we do hope that the end game, or what would happen in the end, would not affect Israel's security. And I believe in general that when it comes to terror, and those extremists in the region, let's not take one terrorist organization as the answer to the other terrorist organization. That's all. And let's see together how we can confront terror coming from all sides, unfortunately.
But how then would you explain Israel's position of neutrality in the Syrian conflict? If you are so willing to confront terrorist organizations, why didn't Israel jump on board, joined Russia in Syria, and help exterminate the jihadi force there? Then the Iranian influence perhaps would have been somewhat curtailed.
I hope that you would not suggest that Israel would send our soldiers to fight in Syria as well. It would not happen, hopefully. And I hope that this is not your suggestion.
There is a practical need for somebody to be there in Syria. Russia doesn't want to send its troops there. Israel doesn't want to send its troops there. The United States doesn't want to do that. That leaves the only option, and the only option is Iran.
Israel is a completely different situation because, unfortunately, there are those that are abusing and exploiting the fact that the public opinion in the Arab world is against Israel, and Israel as being seen as the enemy, that if Israel takes one of the a position that can be exploited by the enemies to say that it's not about Syria, but this is part of the entire Israeli Arab or Jewish-Muslim conflict. This is something would deteriorate the situation, and this is part of our responsibility. But I believe that there is enough power in the world and the responsibility of the international community to confront terror wherever and whatever is the kind of terror, as I said before, whether it is Sunni or Shia. And since you refer to the Sunni terrorist organization, we have, unfortunately, on the Palestinian side, Hamas, that represent the religious side of the conflict. They represent also, in a way, this Sunni ideology that would never accept our right to live in peace in the region. They are using terror as well, and this is something also that needs to be dealt by the international community. And of course, Israel is acting against it when we should.
Ms. Livni, you've already alluded to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I know you've been a loyal proponent of the two-state solution. You claim that's what the majority of the Israeli public wants. If that's the case, why do people keep voting Mr. Netanyahu and his party into power?
Yes, according to the polls, not only my, hopeful thoughts. There is a majority in Israel supporting the idea of two states for two peoples and peace, but yet there is no belief that there is a partner on the other side, that there is no hope for peace. Unfortunately, part of my responsibility here as a leader is to try and convince the Israelis not to give up.
As I understand your argument, you believe that two states is the only option if Israel wants to remain democratic. But do you think the notion of democracy, as you understand it, will stand the test of both time and the test of regional turbulence? Because regional turbulence obviously propels many of those extremist and radical ideas to the center.
I agree that we see all over the world more and more populism. We see fear taking place instead of hope. And this is something that needs to address. But you spoke just about democracy. I would like to speak about the state of Israel as a Jewish democratic state. And it's a matter of values. It's not just a matter of system. And therefore, the way to keep the values of Israel as a Jewish democratic state, the meaning is to divide this tiny place into two different states. One is Israel that gives the answer to the national aspiration of the Jewish people, and the other is an answer to the demands of the national movement of the Palestinians. We have minority of Palestinians living in Israel. There are equal rights citizens, but we need to embrace the idea of two states for two peoples. Each state gives an answer to national aspiration of different peoples. The Palestinian state would be demilitarized. The Palestinians already agreed to this, and this is part of Israel's security demands and also the interest of the world. I mean, nobody wants another terror state in the region. or failed state in the region.
Now, going back to your negotiations with the Palestinians, I heard both you and Saeb Erekat, the chief Palestinian negotiator, express a guarded optimism concerning the Trump administration's willingness to restart the talks. That was about 3 months ago. I gather you're not as optimistic as you were, right?
Unfortunately not, because, you know, when we had this meeting, the first meeting between Trump and Netanyahu, between Trump and Abu Mazen, and in his visit to the region, Trump was speaking about the big deal. And there is only one deal that I believe can work and can give an answer to both of us, Israelis and Palestinians, and this is the two states for two peoples as a solution. I know that this is something that is being supported by Russia as well and by the entire international community. So there was a possibility here to have everybody supporting something that represents the interest of Israel, the Palestinians, and the entire international community. What I believe needs to be done is to call both sides for negotiations with the support of the Arab world and the international community, but not just negotiations for the sake of negotiations, but negotiations on the basis of, the idea is to end the conflict on the basis of two states for two peoples, demilitarized state for Palestine, peace for everybody, and this can be the basis just to start from that we would know where are we going and not just, moving around without any sense of direction. You know that I truly want to solve this conflict. I believe that it's an Israeli and Palestinian interest as well as the international community. But assuming that we would solve this conflict, Iran would not change its ideology, neither Hezbollah nor Hamas. And therefore, it needs to be understood that we need to solve this conflict and to act against extremism and terror in the region as well.
So I want to seize on something that you said just now, and I heard you make that observation before, that the successful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would break the so-called glass ceiling in Israel's relations with other Arab states. I presume, again, you mean mostly Gulf states. How strong of a motivator could that be for Prime Minister Netanyahu, in your view?
This is something, the Arab Peace Initiative and the Arab League decision said that when Israel reached peace with the Palestinians and we would achieve peace in the entire region and normalize their relations with Israel. And therefore, it's not only my opinion. This is something which is on the table. They already said that it is negotiable, but need to be negotiated between Israel and the Palestinians, not between Israel and the Arab world. And therefore, I believe that their role is very important for Israel and for the Palestinians. For Israelis, it is very important because, the average Israeli would say, okay, what can we get from the Palestinians? Any peace treaty is taking some risks. We have terror coming from the Palestinian side. We are giving up territory and also taking some security risks. So the answer is that this can change the strategic situation of Israel in the region. And therefore, it's not just about giving something to the Palestinians, but also getting something from the Arabs. This is one thing from the Israeli perspective, and Netanyahu knows it. But from his, political reasons or other, we don't see a real move toward this. I believe in bilateral negotiations, but I believe that these bilateral negotiations should be supported by the international community, not to replace the decisions that is being needed by both sides, by European or other decisions that the parties are not involved in or make their own. What the Palestinians are doing, they are trying to get the support of a Palestinian state, 67 line, Jerusalem, its capital. This is part or these all issues that need to be negotiated. This is one thing.
Why do they have to be negotiated again? Hasn't that been already negotiated and sealed?
It was negotiated. We breached some gaps, but not enough. In 2014, President Obama wanted to put a framework for negotiations on the table. Even Netanyahu accepted it with reservation, but Abu Mazen didn't give, Mahmoud Abbas didn't give an answer to this, unfortunately. And therefore, it's not too late to put something on the table and to force both leaders to make a decision.
Well, Ms. Livni, we have to leave it there. Unfortunately, the time is up. I really, really appreciate your time here with us.